Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This week, we are going to be covering the chapter in your book relating to primates. And primates are pretty much going to be our focus topic for the next couple weeks. But before we get into any of that, as we start to move through the semester, and particularly as we look at primates, we're going to look at a lot of different primate skeletons. It's important to kind of know the different parts of bone, right? Because for the rest of the semester, we're really going to be talking a lot about bone and how different skeletons are comprised. So there are two general terms. You have epiphyses, which are the ends of each bone, and then you have the diaphysis, which is the middle section or the shaft of each bone. In terms of your bone cells, there are two different types. You have osteoclasts, which absorb bone, and you have osteoblasts, which make bone. And this is kind of a fascinating cycle that continues and actually starts very early on in your life. And what's interesting is by the time you reach your mid-20s, most of you have already recycled all of the bone that you were born with and are now operating essentially on your second skeleton. And then as you kind of progress through life, particularly for women, are at a high chance of this occurring, but there could become an imbalance between the activity between osteoclasts and osteoblasts. In essence, your osteoblasts will begin to slow down, whereas your osteoclasts will continue at the same rate, or in some cases even speed up. And this is where we get conditions like osteoporosis. So here is an example of a bone. This just shows you the end of a tibia, right actually where it connects at your ankle. And there are actually a few things that you can learn from this bone. Just to kind of go over those basic terms that we just covered, right at the very, very end of the bone, all the way to the right side, that is where the epiphyse is. And then if you look at the kind of middle section of the bone where it gets a little wrinkly on the surface, that would be where the diaphysis is. But just by looking at this bone, I can tell that several things were going on with the individual that this bone came from. If you look towards the top of the bone, you'll see right on the kind of shaft of the bone there, you'll see what looks like a little rough patch sticking up away from the bone. That's what we call a bone scab. That's actually a reaction that occurs when your immune system is fighting off an infection for a very long time. In essence, your bone begins to kind of produce extra bone that becomes deposited on the surface. If you look, there's a very large hole right down by the epiphyse there, and the reason for that hole, it's not because it decayed, it's not because it is there naturally. That individual was actually shot in the ankle with a stone arrow. So in essence, what you're seeing with that hole is where the stone arrow punctured through. And initially, it was just the tip of the arrow that punctured through and into the bone, but then subsequent infections began to eat away the bone, and then you began to have this very, very large pocket, right? So there's a whole lot that we, in modern science can learn about bone. Just by looking at it, we can tell, certain health conditions of the individual, whether or not they received traumatic injury, and we can even tell a little bit about nutrition as well. So as you kind of read about bone and in some of the articles you may come across, if you do further research in this area, you'll come across something called Wolff's Law. It's the notion that loads and forces that are put on bone over time will slightly alter the shape of the bone. There is some truth to this, but a lot of researchers like to take a little bit of liberty in terms of interpretations using Wolff's Law. So it's kind of BS. And the reason for this is, we used to say that agriculturalists versus hunter-gatherer groups of humans, whichever group had the greatest amount of activity, which would be the agriculturalists, would have thicker bone, right? Because the more load you put on the bone, the more activity you're doing, the more it will alter the shape of the bone. But actually, it is we found quite the opposite. Agriculturalists tend to have thinner bone than hunter-gatherer groups do. We also, in our species and in a lot of primate species that we're going to look at, have something called a prolonged childhood. It takes a long time for our babies to reach maturity, and there's actually a reason for that. In humans, particularly, it's because we have these very large brains, and those brains are not, you're not born equipped with the ability to use or utilize your brain to its fullest extent. So in essence, you need that long childhood to gain experience in order to become a proficient adult member of your species. So the question is, why is it really advantageous to have a very long childhood but a short lactation period? Particularly in primates, it is because, well, the closer or faster that you can get back to reproductive receptivity as a female, the more babies you're going to have over a lifetime, the greater your reproductive fecundity will be. We also have something in humans that's rather unique, and this occurs also in our great ape cousins like chimpanzees and gorillas. We have this notion of other care, in which parts or members of our families actually help care for the young of their children, right? So in essence, we call this kind of the grandmother hypothesis, where you have non-reproductive women or elderly women can give their own child a reproductive advantage by helping care for their grandchildren, right? So in essence, by taking kind of the workload off of their daughter or son, their daughter or son is able to produce more for the family. They're able to also kind of get back to having more children more quickly. So, and remember, in the terms of evolution, right, the name of the game is reproduction, right? Your fitness is directly related to how many babies you can have over a given lifetime, how many times, in essence, you are spreading your genetic material into the next generation. So remember, we talked about this before, but I want you to keep this in mind as we move through the semester here, and we start to look at the members of our ancient lineage in terms of the genus Homo, as well as the genus Australopithecine. So think about your genetic adaptations, like your sickle cell trait that we talked about, your developmental adaptations, like the physical changes to your facial features as a response to the environment. Think about the acclimatization adaptations of moving into high altitudes, that all humans have a natural base set of adaptations. And also think about cultural. And that's going to be more important when we get towards the end of the semester and we start talking about, what's happened since 10,000 BC until now, and then anthropology in the future. Cultural systems and cultural mechanisms are really going to be what's the driving force of our evolution. Because remember, evolution or physical evolution, to change actual physical parts in the body, takes, naturally takes many generations. Could take thousands and thousands of years. For example, we're going to talk about the development of bipedality in humans, and that was a 4 million year process, right? It took a very long time for, in many different species, in this long kind of progressive trend, for us to eventually, become creatures that walk on two legs. So all of these adaptations are very important, and culture is going to play an even more important role because it is our way of adapting to the variety of environments on the planet. So what we call all of these is functional adaptations, because these adaptations increase your ability to have more babies over a given lifetime, thus increasing your fitness within a given environment, right? So a functional adaptation is any adaptation that causes a biological change to increase fitness. So one thing that we'll talk about a little later on the semester, but just to give you a little bit of preview before we jump into talking about primates. As humans, we kind of go through these different trends, particularly here in the United States, where obesity is an issue. And there's a reason why we have these kind of body mass indexes, and why they vary between men and women, vary between different populations. Really, your kind of BMI, or your kind of body fat deposition, is going to vary widely depending on where your ancestors kind of grew up about 10,000 years ago. So human populations, in essence, there are several patterns that we do notice, like human populations that require heavy workloads from reproductive women will have reduced birth weights, and reduced birth rates. And we actually see that happening in the Western world now. Birth rates are falling in the United States as well as in parts of Europe. High fitness, in essence, equals low lifetime energy expenditure, right? The less energy you're expending on doing tasks and acquiring food and things like that, the greater the chances are that you're able to have more children, right? And, I'm going to say it repeatedly throughout the semester, the name of the game in evolution is reproduction, right? It's passing those genes to the next generation. So in essence, what we find today is that being too skinny or being too fat can negatively affect reproduction or your fertility, right? So it's kind of a fine balance that you have to kind of strike in order to maintain that reproductive health. So speaking about overnutrition, things that we'll talk about later, you could have diabetes, right? We all know about type 2 diabetes. There are different types. You also have cholesteremia. You actually can develop cholesteremia due to dietary trends as well as genetic conditions. You have obesity, of course, and that comes with a whole host of actual physical ailments, different stressors put on joints and things like that. It causes more wear and tear over time. And then something that we're actually seeing a huge increase over the past few years here, especially amongst children, is fatty liver disease, right? And this comes from eating very highly processed sugars and a lot of carbohydrates, and your body will begin to take those sugars and deposit them as fats around your liver, right? And this is in essence, not very good, right? It actually leads to liver dysfunction later on in life. And all of this is culturally driven, right? Because humans, we like to say that we're omnivores, and in a sense we are, but we have kind of a 70-30 split in our diet. Really what we should be doing is consuming 70% vegetable material and 30% protein material. But it's all of these kind of cultural practices that have really changed. The one I like to use as an example here, you can see below what looks like a kind of fried loaf. That is called Native American fry bread. And anyone that comes from the Southwest can tell you that this is kind of a staple in a lot of Native American households. And if you go to those households and you ask them, they will tell you that this is traditional Native American fare. But in reality, it actually isn't. This particular dish is actually less than 120 years old. It wasn't really invented until the early 20th century, when most Native Americans were living on the reservation, and the government was supplementing their hunting and things like that they were kind of able to do with these products, right? And some of those products were lard and flour, and the only thing you can really make out of lard and flour is kind of this fried version of bread. So moving on, we're going to start talking about primates, what it is that makes a primate, and we're going to look at a whole bunch of different primates. So I don't want you to get kind of intimidated by the amount of slides that are in this presentation. A lot of them are photos because I want you to get a good idea of what the different type of primates we have living today are. And then as we move on through the semester, we will actually talk about early primate evolution in about a week. So we'll look at things like how do we relate to some of our ancestors, looking at your Homo sapien on the left here, your Australopithecus afarensis in the middle there, and then all the way on the right you can see a chimpanzee. We'll also look at different reproductive practices of chimpanzees. And, we already talked a little bit about sperm competition, which is that unique form of competition that chimpanzees participate in, where male chimpanzees try to outcompete each other in producing sperm, which causes their testicles to swell to very large sizes. As a matter of fact, in this photo, you can see in that person's right hand, you can see a chimpanzee brain. And in the other hand, you can see a chimpanzee testicle, right? So during the sperm competition, sometimes their testicles will literally get as large as their brains. So remember that in the 1700s, Carolus Linnaeus developed the binomial nomenclature system for naming plants and animals. Our scientific name is Homo sapiens. We belong to the genus Homo. Animals and plants that are similar in morphology, i.e. shape, and anatomy are grouped together, right? And the system is still useful because groups that resemble each other often share a common ancestor. If we look at an example, we have Equus calibus and Equus quagga, which are essentially your kind of common horse and zebras, right? So they both belong to the same genus, and they are so closely related that even in some instances out in nature, when we do have two species that are very closely related, we get things like zorses, right? We can have crossbreeding that will actually, kind of be able to breed without any real issues, right? And this kind of throws a big kind of wrench in how we define a species, right? Remember we talked about the biological species concept, that if they can breed with one another and produce viable offspring, then they should be considered the same species. So what do we do in an instance like this, where we have these two species that look very different on the outside and live in different areas of the world, but are actually capable of reproducing and producing viable offspring? Do we consider them the same species then? That's kind of a question for biologists and taxonomists that haven't really been answered. Right, so animals from the same genus can sometimes breed, and this is because they are so genetically similar that they shared a common ancestor not so long ago. Now we will move on to talking about what traits do primates have in terms of their physical form that makes them primates. So what kind of separates us from the rest of the primate kingdom, right? So if we look at our classification according to the Linnaeus system, we belong to the kingdom Animalia, which means moving and feeding by the mouth, the phylum Chordata, meaning having a notochord, the subphylum Vertebrata, which means having a backbone, the class Mammalia, which means warm-blooded and furry, and the order Primates. So what the heck is a primate? Well, when we talk about primate evolutionary traits, we use two kind of descriptive terms to refer to them. And in your lab, you're actually going to be reconstructing what we call phylogenetic trees, which place different traits in relation to the last common ancestor for a species. So it's a good way of kind of looking at the evolutionary process, right? So we have generalized traits versus specialized traits. So if it's generalized, it's a trait that's adapted for many different functions. If it's specialized, it's a trait that is adapted for a specific function. For example, we're going to look at the eye, which is a primate creature, and I hope you follow the link and watch the video on it. It's a primate creature that has a very long middle finger that's used for digging grubs out of trees, right? So that's a very specialized trait. We're going to look at primitive versus derived, right? If it's a primitive trait, it's a trait that's more like the last common ancestor with other related species. If we look at a derived trait, it's traits that are more newly evolved. So characteristics of primates, they are a very, very diverse order of mammals. Some are very tiny and mouse-like, and others are huge and weigh over 200 pounds. This includes prosimians, monkeys, apes, and of course, humans. So what do they all have in common? Well, all of them have some form of color vision. If we're talking about prosimians, they have a very rudimentary, or if we're talking in terms of our traits, they have a very primitive color system in their eyes, right? So they can generally only see in two colors. Monkeys, apes, and humans, on the other hand, we have what's called trichromatic vision. We can see in three colors, so we have a more derived vision system. We have flat, grasping nails on all of our 5 fingers, and this is a very, very primitive trait. Relatively similar dietary patterns, which haven't changed very much for a long time. We have forward-facing eyes that are on the front of our face, which allows us to see forward, but not so well on the sides, which gives us kind of this stereoscopic vision, allowing us to kind of focus in objects in the far distance, which gives us the ability to have depth perception, right? And these last 3 are kind of very important if you think about a creature that lives and moves around in the trees, which most primates do. So our primates include everything from our tiny little mouse lemurs here all the way up to our very large gorillas. There are three main tendencies that are outlined by famous primatologist Wilfred LaGrosse-Clark in terms of primate traits. Most are adapted for a life in the trees, which means they have arboreal adaptations to their skeleton, and we'll talk about some of those adaptations later. They eat a variety of different foods. What we refer to this as dietary plasticity, right? They have the ability to eat different categories of food. And for, in a general sense, primates in general come into the categories of insectivores, which are insect eaters, frugivores, which are exclusive fruit eaters, omnivores, which eat a little bit of everything, and herbivores, which eat only exclusively vegetation. And I will tell you, herbivores are actually very rare amongst primates. All primates eat some form of fruit. What varies amongst the primate species is where they get their protein. And the third tendency is parental investment, right? Primates have less babies on average than other mammals, so primates invest in a lot in parenting. And in most primate species, you have alloparenting, which is when members of a group take care of each other's babies. And alloparenting is not primate specific. We do have very rare examples where we even have cross-special alloparenting, like this dog that adopted a kind of brood of kittens here. But alloparenting and kind of social living is a very, very primitive trait in humans. Amongst the very, very first primates, they all had social living. Like one of the oldest kind of relic species that we have that still exists from kind of early evolutionary days of primates are the ring-tailed lemurs of Madagascar that we can see down here on the right. They are a highly social group. As a matter of fact, so social that they have certain rituals that they all do together. As an example, the males in the morning, every morning they wake up and they all kind of chat with each other for a little while in the tree. Then they all go find a branch, and in unison they kind of stand on that branch and pee off the edge of it. So parental investment is due to a lengthened period of maturation and infant dependency as well as gestation. Low reproductive rates, especially among apes and humans or hominoidees, and a relatively large and complex brain. All of these things are kind of factors in what leads to our species and other ape species having to have a higher degree of parental investment than other mammals. So here's a chimpanzee with their baby, right? And a lot of teaching and a lot of learning goes between parent to child, right? In apes as well as in humans. If we look at this chart that shows maturation periods, right? You can see that in humans, our lifespan is generally fairly long. Our juvenile period as well is very long. Our infancy is very long, but not as long as a chimpanzee. So in essence, it's kind of interesting when you see that infancy may take a little bit longer in some of these other great ape species, but their lifespans are significantly shorter than the human species. Right, but all of these different primates require long periods of time. If you look at the creature in the primate family that's closer to kind of what mammals are like, our lemurs, you know, the more ancestral, more primitive species, you can see that their maturation periods for their infants are much, much shorter, right, much more similar to other mammals. So all primates share an arboreal common ancestor, and we have adaptations that deal with locomotion and give primates a versatile skeletal structure with flexible arms and hands. All primates have a clavicle and a shoulder girdle, right? This is what gives us the ability to rotate our arm all the way around, right? This is our shoulder joint. We have very flexible limbs with a wide range of motion. We have an opposable thumb and an opposable big toe. Your opposable thumb is called your pollicis. Your opposable big toe is called your hallux. We also have the tendency for our trunk or our body section to be upright. And our spine has several regions, right? In a lot of other apes and in the spinal regions, they only have 2 curvatures. In humans, there are 3 curvatures because we are bipedal creatures, so we have a little bit of an extra modification to our spinal column. More than our kind of ape cousins. And monkeys, on the other hand, who are exclusively arboreal, they actually have very long C-shaped spines and no curvatures. So just giving you kind of a preview of kind of some of these different locomotion modems. You have orangutans, which are quadrimanual. They're very, very good at moving in the trees because their feet and their hands are very, very similar. They kind of function the same. In the middle there, you have a chifferella, which is a type of lemur. And these are kind of what we call vertical clingers and leapers. They kind of scurry up the side of a branch, and then they leap off of that branch onto other surfaces. And then in the very right there, you have a chimpanzee, which spends a fair amount of time in the trees, but also spends a fair amount of time on the ground as well. And there are senses that help with life in the tree, right? Our touch is very sensitive, right? We have dermal ridges at the ends of our fingers and toes, and we have flat nails instead of claws. We have good vision. We have depth perception due to our eyes facing forward, as well as color vision, right? All of these give us an advantage with living in the trees, right? So going along with an enhanced sense of vision is a decreased reliance on the senses of smell and hearing, right? Thus, our olfactory bulb, or the center of smell in our noses and in our brains, has shrank over time. So primates in general, we are a species and a group of species that relies far more on sight than smell or sound. This is just showing you, if we look at, and we don't need to get into kind of, this is relating body mass to brain size, but what I want you to pay attention to is the olfactory bulbs that are on the front. If we look at a chimpanzee, olfactory bulb is tiny, right? Because they are very more similar to us, right? If we look at a monkey, they're a little more primitive. Their olfactory bulb is a little bit larger, right? They are a little bit more reliant on smell. But if we go to our prosimians, our lemurs, which are the most primitive in the order of primates, we see that their olfactory bulbs are much, much larger. And you're going to notice that when you look at pictures of prosimians like our lemurs, as well as when you look at their skulls in the lab activities, you're going to notice that they have very long snouts compared to our monkeys and our apes. And that's because they have that more heavy reliance on smell than monkeys and apes do. So to give you a little bit of a preview on kind of comparative anatomy and to show you some of these traits that I'm talking about in terms of what separates primates from the rest of the mammals, and this will actually help you on your lab an awful lot. Well, what you're seeing here is a typical mammal skull. This is a dog skull, and notice that there is no bone enclosing the eye, right? This is where the eye would be located, and you can see on the side there that the eye is nice and open, right? There's no bone enclosing or circling the entire eye. That is a huge difference that we see between mammals and primates. Primates, on the other hand, have bone that go around the entirety of their eye, right? And we'll take a look at that here in a second. There we go. Right, so this is a loris skull, and we have two different types of bone enclosures that go around a primate's eye socket. And this goes to show you how much of a visually based creature we are, that we have actually developed a bony system within our eye that protects our eyes from damage, right? As you can see on this loris, the front of the eyes are on the front of the skull, and you can see just by the eye sockets that they are huge. As a matter of fact, in lorises, their eyes, in some cases, are as large as their brains. But you can see the kind of ring that occurs around the side of the eye here. This is what we call a post-orbital bar. And you can see that it's actually open in the back. There's no bone in the back of the eye socket, but there is bone enclosing and providing structure around the entire front of the eye. If we look at this baboon skull, or this female baboon, on the other hand, you can see that not only is there a post-orbital bar, there's also a post-orbital closure, right, and a bony wall along the entire back of the eye, right? You can see there's bone all through this area. So as we kind of move through our evolutionary history, first starting with our prosimians, who evolved first, they kind of start with that post-orbital bar, which provides some support and some protection, but as we kind of move into a creature that is more reliant on sight and a class of creatures that are more reliant on living in the trees and moving around in the trees, this is when we start to see really that kind of bone starting to enclose the eye in its entirety. So something that we will talk about as we move through the semester, and something I want you to consider as we talk about our own species as well as our kind of distant relatives, is that dominance hierarchies matter within primate groups. As a matter of fact, in the picture you're seeing here, these are the macacas or macaques from Japan, or otherwise more commonly known as the Japanese snow monkeys. And on the Animal Planet and kind of some of the TV shows that feature animals, they like to show these guys because these guys like to hang out in these hot springs, so they kind of hang out in these like hot tubs all day. Well, what they don't really show you on those shows is that only the dominant individuals get to sit in the hot springs. The non-dominant individuals are the ones who are very low on the dominance hierarchy, have to sit on the outside, right? And in some cases, they try to sneak in, are able to get into the water for a little while, but they end up getting chased out by a dominant male, and they could actually freeze to death on the side of the pool, kind of sitting there watching their more dominant compatriots enjoy the hot springs. So the question is do humans have a dominance hierarchy, and how is it expressed, right? And this is kind of something that cultural anthropologists have talked about a lot of when they talk about the development of class systems and inequality in terms of equality, medical access and economy and things like that. That could be our kind of way of expressing our primate dominance hierarchy. So if we look at color vision and depth perception, primates know their world primarily through our vision, right? So most animals out there, most mammals are colorblind and have a poor capacity to judge visual distance or to focus in fine detail. So color vision allows primates to know if fruit is ripe and if leaves are young, which means they are full of protein, right? And we know that fruiting trees that produce different colored fruits began to really evolve at and around the same time that primates evolved, right? So we have a very intimate relationship with fruit. So depth perception is a hallmark of primates as well as bird species. So having depth perception, if you look at this image, will let you know the distance between these branches and whether or not these leaves are ripe or whether or not they are kind of old. If you look at, leaves tend to change color a lot when they are new versus when they are old. You can see on the right, those are leaves that are kind of been sitting there for a while. They're green, they're fully green. They're a little eaten up and a little beat up, and the leaves on the right are leaves that are very young in this particular plant. And as they age, they turn green. In some plants, it's quite the opposite. In some plants, the young leaves are very, very light green, as well as the older leaves are very, very dark green. For example, in our own species, white tea that people drink is actually the juvenile form of black tea, and in some cases green tea. So what they do is they just pick the tea leaves while they're young and still kind of fresh and still very light green, and that's how you get white tea. If we look at another primate feature, we have manipulation and primate hands. We have two different types of grip that we are capable of primates, and it, depending on the species, really depends on your proficiency with each. Power grip is where all fingers of the hand curl around the object. Many, many primates can do this, and apes are particularly good at this. And then we have precision grip, which is where the tip of the thumb is opposed to the tips of all the fingers. In essence, this is saying you can take your thumb and touch it to the tips of all of your fingers. So in essence, it gives you much more control over the tool that you are using. And humans in particular and our ancient ancestors are very, very good at using precision grip. And why is our precision and power grip so good in primates? It is because we have dermal ridges on our fingers with help with gripping, right? They also leave fingerprints. And it's actually something very interesting. You can kind of feel the effectiveness of your dermal ridges if you just kind of take your fingers, lay them flat on top of a tabletop and drag your hand across the tabletop, right? You can feel the resistance that your fingers give. It feels like they are almost gripping to that tabletop, right? That is the dermal ridges on the tips of your fingers kind of doing what they're designed to do. So apes' fingers are very long and their thumb is short. Humans, on the other hand, our fingers are relatively short, and the thumb can readily touch the tips of them. So apes, in essence, cannot straighten out their fingers, especially knuckle walkers like our chimpanzees or our gorillas, right? So this is showing you a major difference between us versus our kind of closest primate cousins. We have relatively short fingers because we don't really climb trees anymore. We don't need to have long fingers to grip around branches, but we use a lot of tools and we manipulate our environment a lot, so we need to have a longer thumb so that we can touch our thumb to the tips of our fingers and be able to have that good precision grip. Chimpanzees and gorillas, on the other hand, spend more time in the trees, hence they have longer fingers, and they, aren't really using tools all that much, except to kind of acquire certain food items. So they don't really need that fine precision grip that we have as humans. And there is a big difference between what we see in primate feet, right? Between our closest ape cousins and humans, right? If we look at this difference, on the left you see a chimpanzee foot, and on the right you see a human foot. Notice the amount of space between what's called the hallux and the rest of the foot bones. There's a big degree of space in between the chimpanzees, and you can see that they're, even at the bottom of the bone here, you can see that there's actually a little bit of wiggle room, right? You can see how much space there is at this joint. So that means that this toe is fully opposable and they can move it in all sorts of different directions. If we look at the human, on the other hand, there's not a whole lot of space in between the hallux versus the rest of the toes, and there is really no movement, and those bones at the bottom base of that hallux are very, very close together, right? That's why our big toes are not opposable. And the big difference and the big kind of reason or cause for this is because, well, our chimpanzees walk on all fours, right, and move around in the trees, so they need that extra grip. Humans, on the other hand, we walk on two legs. We need that foot and that toe to be very stiff in order to provide a foundation for our ability to balance on 2 feet. This is showing you a baby chimpanzee foot, so you can see that huge degree of space in between the toes versus the kind of big toe. So let's take a look at primate dentition, right? And this is talking about primate teeth. So what makes our teeth different from other mammals? In terms of primate dentition, we have retained primitive characteristics in our teeth. We have a reduced number of teeth compared to other mammals, and we have evolved different dental specializations based on diet. We only get one permanent set of teeth, and that's something that's kind of unique too. In some mammal species, they actually get more than one set of teeth. And in some mammal species, like anteaters, for example, they actually grow teeth continually throughout their lives. They grind the teeth down, and then more teeth grow out, right? The same thing with rodents. So there are 2 general dental formulas that we see in primates, and this is going to be very important because this is one of the good things that you can use to determine if you are looking at a primate skull versus another mammal skull. So what you do is you essentially take one of the tooth rows. Usually you like to use the mandible because it's a little bit easier to see, the jawbone in the bottom, and you cut it in half, essentially, right? So you're only looking at a quarter of the teeth in your mouth, right? You essentially take the mandible, you cut it in half, and then you count the types of teeth, right? And in those types, you have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. That's what we see in humans and other great apes. And what we see in New World monkeys, as well as in prosimians, is a 2-1-3-3. So 2 incisors, 1 canine, 3 premolars, and 3 molars. So the dental characteristics is that we have a simple cusp pattern on our molar teeth. We either have 3 to 4 cusps. There are either 32 or 36 teeth in the mouth total. And know the term heterodont. This means having several different types of teeth, right? We've just looked at them, your incisors, your canines, your molars, each with a different function, right? So in primates, the canine teeth are used for behavior. In other primate species are used for males to scare other males away from potential mates and things like that. The incisors in all primates, your front teeth, are used for peeling the rinds off of fruit, right? They kind of act like almost like a flathead screwdriver or like a paint scraper. And the premolars as well as the molars. The premolars in a lot of primate species are a little bit sharper, and they are used for kind of shearing meat as well as crunching insects. And the molars all the way in the back, those are, of course, your mashing teeth, right? That's what you use to mash up fruit and vegetable matter. So one thing that we do see, and a big thing that's going to give you a good instance that'll tell you if you're looking at an old world monkey or an ape or a non-human ape, is you're going to see a diastema, which is a little gap in the bottom tooth row. And what that is there for is to accommodate the very large canine tooth in the upper tooth row, or the what we call the palatal tooth row, to kind of come down and rest in the jaw. In essence, in these creatures that have very large canines and these primates that have very large canines, you need those canines to be able to sit together so that you can close your mouth and chew effectively, right? That's why that diastema exists. And when you look at these skulls in the lab, it'll make a lot more sense because you're going to see how that top tooth row comes down. So this is what we call the sectorial canine complex, right? That diastema actually has a secondary function as well. Having that little gap there allows those two teeth to rub together when you open and close your mouth. So as these large primates that are opening and closing their mouths, what happens is it sharpens those canine teeth, right? And those canine teeth are used to scare other primates. So as you're opening and closing your mouth, as you're chewing and going about your daily life as a big old gorilla, you're sharpening those canine teeth so that the next time another male gorilla tries to challenge you, you will have nice, sharp, pointing canine teeth to scare him with. We also have Bilophondant. There's actually a few different ways you can hear this word pronounced. You have Bilophondant or Bilophondant. Either way is fine. And this is what this is showing as a pattern that we see in some primates' teeth, where you see a ridge that goes across the center of the teeth, right? Another pattern that we see is what we call the Y5 pattern, which is essentially where you have these different molar cusps, and you can kind of draw a Y shape in the middle of the tooth, and it separates all those cusps away from each other. The Y5 pattern we see very commonly in apes and humans, right? You can actually feel it if you run your tongue along your little molar teeth. And the Bilophondant pattern is something that we see very heavily in prosimians as well as monkeys. So in essence, teeth are adapted to diet, right? We see far more fruit eating in large primates like gorillas and other apes, and hence they have the Y5 pattern. And we see a lot more insect and kind of plant eating, plants, leaves and things like that in monkeys as well as prosimians, and they need those kind of sharper cusps on their teeth in order to kind of grind all that up. We also have if we're looking at other mammalian species, if we look at tapirs or chinchillas or rats, part of the Muridae, genus Muridae, they have different types of teeth as well. I don't expect you to know this, but it's termed LOPHODONT teeth, where they're kind of all kind of a single purpose, and they're mostly used for grinding vegetation. You can tell by their kind of flat ridged surface. And human teeth can actually tell us where someone's ancestors come from. For Native American and people of Asian descent, they have a feature of their incisors which is called a shovel shape, right? If you look at it from kind of the bottom, you can see kind of it looks like the head of a shovel, right? So and that's a bit different. If you look at a European and African incisors, on the other hand, they're very straight all the way across, whereas a Asian and Native American incisor, there's a little bit of a ridge on both sides. We call that being shovel-shaped.